Destiny is not a straight road but a winding river. The currents of fortune can pull you under, or they can carry you to a shore you never knew existed. Dust settled on her travel dress, a fine gray powder that mingled with the sweat of fear. Lillian Mayhew did not dare to look up at the man walking ahead. His silhouette, carved against the blazing Montana sky, seemed a part of the landscape itself. It was wild, unforgiving, and utterly alien. Hours ago, she was a merchant's daughter, her head filled with quiet dreams of a respectable life and a gentle husband. Now she was a piece of property, a wager lost in a desperate card game by her own father. Her world had been reduced to the shuffling sound of his moccasins on the dry earth, and the heavy beat of her own heart, a frantic drum marking the path to an unknown, terrifying future. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on her. The Crow warrior, known only as Quiet Hawk to the settlers, had said nothing. He simply watched with impassive dark eyes as her father's trembling hands signed the bill of sale. Joshua Mayhew, a man broken by debt and whiskey, did not even meet her gaze as he pushed the paper across the rough wooden table of the saloon. Her name was written there, a substitute for the gold coins he did not possess. The transaction was swift, brutal, and silent. There were no pleas, no arguments. Just the scratch of a pen sealing her fate. This was not a journey to a new life. It was a slow walk to the scaffold of her future, and every step took her further from the world she knew, a world that had betrayed her in the most profound way imaginable. Lillian studied the man leading her away. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the unforgiving land. He carried a rifle with practiced ease, and a long knife was sheathed at his belt. He was tall, with broad shoulders and long black hair that fell freely down his back. His presence was overwhelming, a silent storm of contained power. She could not read his expression. It was a mask of stoicism, revealing nothing of the man beneath. Was he cruel? Was he kind? She had no way of knowing. This terrifying uncertainty was a torment worse than any shouted threat. He was a mystery, a captor whose intentions were hidden behind a wall of silence that seemed as vast and impenetrable as the mountains looming on the horizon. They arrived at a small, isolated cabin, nestled on a mountainside as the sun began to bleed across the western sky. It was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window that stared out like a vacant eye. This was her new reality. This was her prison. The finality of it washed over her, a cold wave of despair that extinguished the last embers of hope. The man, Kano, gestured for her to enter. His first unspoken command. She crossed the threshold, her body rigid with apprehension. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, a sound that echoed the closing of a chapter, the end of the life of Lillian Mayhew, the merchant's daughter. A new, terrifying story was about to begin. Kano, for that was his true name, had never sought trouble in the world of the white man. He had seen enough of their greed and their casual cruelty to last a lifetime. He was an outcast from his own people, exiled for refusing to join a bloody raid against innocent settlers years ago. That single act of defiance had defined his existence, turning him into a solitary shadow drifting between two worlds, belonging to neither. He lived by his own code of honor, a code that seemed to have no place in the changing frontier. He hunted, he trapped, and he traded, asking only to be left alone in the quiet solitude of the mountains that he called home. But peace was a rare commodity in this harsh and unforgiving land. He had only gone to the saloon in Dust Devil Creek to trade a few prime beaver pelts for flour, coffee, and ammunition. He intended to be in and out quickly, to avoid the suspicious stares and muttered insults that always followed him. But the scene at the back card table made his blood run cold. He recognized Joshua Mayhew, the town merchant, his face pale and slick with sweat. The man was drowning in debt, and his opponent was Sheriff Clayton, a man known for his corruption and his predatory nature. The air was thick with tension and the smell of cheap whiskey. Kano watched from the shadows, a silent observer to a drama of desperation and ruin that was all too common on the frontier. Sheriff Clayton played his final hand with a smug grin. "Well, Mayhew," he drawled, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "it seems your luck has run out." Joshua Mayhew looked at his cards, his face ashen. He had nothing left. Then, in a final, desperate act, he offered the one thing he still possessed. his daughter. The sheriff's eyes lit up with a greedy, possessive light. His deputies, standing behind him, exchanged lewd smiles. Kano saw their expressions and knew instantly the cruel fate that awaited the girl. They did not see a person. They saw an object, a prize to be claimed and used. A cold, hard anger settled in Kano's chest. He could not stand by and watch this happen. He stepped forward from the shadows, his sudden appearance causing a ripple of surprise through the saloon. He moved to the table and, without a word, laid a thick stack of cured furs upon it. The pelts were of the highest quality, worth far more than the merchant's debt. Clayton stared at the furs, then at Kano, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and anger. "What is this?" the sheriff demanded. Kano did not answer. He simply met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as flint. The message was clear. The debt was paid. The girl was his. It was an act born not of desire, but of a deep and profound contempt for the weakness and wickedness of men like Clayton. It was an act that would change both of their lives forever. The first days in the small mountain cabin were a torture of silence and suspicion. Lillian expected violence, or at the very least, a command that would confirm her status as a slave. But nothing happened. Quiet Hawk, or Kano as she now knew he was called, gave her the single cot to sleep on, while he himself took a bedroll on the floor near the hearth. He maintained a respectful distance, never once making her feel threatened. He would leave at dawn to hunt or check his traps and return at dusk, often leaving a piece of fresh game by the door. He asked nothing of her, yet his silent presence was a constant reminder of her captivity. She was a prisoner, but her cage had no visible bars. Her pride rebelled against this passive existence. She was not a possession, not a piece of property to be kept. So she began a small, silent war. She would intentionally oversalt the stew she cooked from the meat he provided. She would accidentally spill the water she fetched from the creek, forcing him to make the trip again. She expected anger, a harsh word, perhaps even a blow. Instead, he would simply eat the salty stew without comment, or quietly take the buckets and fetch more water himself. His unshakable calm was more unnerving than any display of temper. It was a quiet battle of wills, and she was beginning to realize it was a battle she could not win through simple defiance. The turning point came one afternoon as she was sweeping the rough wooden floor. Her broom nudged a small, loose floorboard beneath his cot. Curiosity overriding her caution, she lifted it. Beneath, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a small wooden chest. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside, she did not find weapons or gold, but something far more unexpected. There were several worn volumes of Shakespeare and a collection of poems. The discovery shattered her preconceived notions. This was not the library of a savage. How could a man who read poetry be the brute she had imagined? The world, which had seemed so starkly black and white, was suddenly filled with confusing shades of gray. That evening, when Kano returned from his hunt, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. The tension had lessened, replaced by a fragile curiosity. As they ate their meal in the usual silence, he reached into a pouch at his side. He placed a small object next to her plate and pushed it gently towards her. It was a wolf, exquisitely carved from a piece of dark wood, its head raised in a silent howl. The craftsmanship was remarkable. It was not a demand or a command. It was a gift, an offering. It was the first bridge built across the deep, silent chasm that separated their two worlds, and for the first time, Lillian felt a flicker of something other than fear. It felt almost like hope. A blizzard descended upon the mountains without warning, a raging tempest of wind and snow that buried the world in white. The cabin, once a symbol of her confinement, became their only sanctuary against the storm's fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the door and whistling through the small gaps in the log walls. For 2 days, they were trapped, the world shrinking to the 4 walls of the small room. The enforced proximity was both comforting and unnerving. The silence, which had been a barrier between them, now felt heavy and suffocating, amplified by the storm's relentless roar outside. The world had been erased, leaving only the two of them. It was Lillian who broke the silence first. "You read?" she stated, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. It was not a question. Kano looked up from the fire he was tending, his dark eyes meeting hers. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The missionary school taught me the words," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "But they could not teach me to forget my own tongue, my own people." He spoke of the school as a place that had tried to strip him of his identity, to civilize him by erasing the man he was born to be. He described the cold rooms, the harsh discipline, and the deep, abiding loneliness of a boy torn from his family and his culture. He continued to speak, the words flowing like a river that had been dammed for too long. He told her of his return to his village, a stranger in his own home. His ability to read and write in the white man's language was seen not as a skill, but as a betrayal. He was too white for his people. Yet, in the town, he was, and always would be, an Indian, an object of scorn and suspicion. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He spoke of the smallpox epidemic that had swept through his village years later, taking his wife and young son, leaving him utterly alone. His voice never broke, but Lillian could hear the profound grief etched into every word he spoke. As she listened to his quiet, pain-filled story, the last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it took her breath away. She was not looking at her captor anymore. She was seeing a man whose soul bore scars as deep, if not deeper than her own. His loneliness mirrored hers. His sense of displacement echoed her own feelings of being lost and abandoned. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, warm cabin, something had shifted. The walls of silence and fear had finally crumbled. They were no longer captor and captive, but two wounded souls, finding a fragile, unexpected solace in a shared blizzard of sorrow and isolation. When the snow finally melted, revealing a world washed clean and new, an unwelcome visitor arrived at the cabin. Deputy Finn, a large, slovenly man with a perpetual sneer, rode up on his horse, his hand resting arrogantly on the revolver at his hip. "Sheriff Clayton sent me," he announced, his eyes lingering on Lillian with a look that made her skin crawl, "just to check on the welfare of our town's lost lamb." His tone was mocking, his words laced with a thinly veiled contempt. He dismounted and swaggered towards the cabin, his spurs jingling with a sound that felt like a violation of the mountain's peace. He represented the town's judgment, its prejudice, and its menace. Kano emerged from the cabin, moving to stand between Lillian and the deputy. He was unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, but he stood as tall and immovable as the ancient pines surrounding them. "She is well," Kano said, his voice calm and even, yet carrying a note of finality. Finn laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Is she now, or is that what the savage makes her say?" He took another step forward, his hand still on his firearm. "I think I will just have a look for myself." Lillian's heart pounded in her chest. She saw the glint of violence in the deputy's eyes, the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed his power, and the fear he inspired in others. Kano did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the deputy's gaze, and in his eyes there was a cold, quiet fury that was more intimidating than any weapon. It was the look of a man who had seen true hardship, a man who had nothing left to lose and who would not be moved. The air grew thick with unspoken threat. Finn, for all his bluster, was a bully, not a fighter. He hesitated, the sneer on his face faltering. He saw something in Kano's eyes that he did not understand, a depth of resolve that his own shallow cruelty could not match. He was looking at a man who would die before he would yield. The deputy took a half step back, his bravado evaporating under Kano's silent, unyielding stare. "All right," Finn muttered, clearing his throat and trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Just doing my job." He turned and walked back to his horse with a haste that betrayed his fear. He mounted quickly and rode away without a backward glance, disappearing down the mountain path. Kano watched him go, his expression unchanging. Then he turned to Lillian. He had not touched her, had not spoken a word of reassurance, but his silent defense had been more powerful than any declaration. In that moment, Lillian knew, with absolute certainty, that in this wild land, her only true protector was the man she had once feared most. The spring thaw brought not only warmth to the mountains, but also a sickness. A fever took hold of Lillian, beginning with a chill that soon turned into a raging fire. The world dissolved into a blur of shivering fits and nightmarish dreams. She was too weak to move, too weak to even speak. Kano did not leave her side. He moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, his presence a constant, comforting shadow in her delirium. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths and gently spooned a bitter, earthy broth between her parched lips. It was a concoction of mountain herbs he had learned about as a boy, a remedy passed down through generations. He tended to her with a patience that was both surprising and deeply moving. As the fever raged, her mind drifted back to her past. In her delirium, she spoke of her broken dreams, of the simple life she had craved. She cried out for her mother, long dead, and whispered of the profound betrayal of her father, the man who had sold her to settle a debt. The words tumbled out, a torrent of fear and sorrow that she had kept locked away for so long. Through it all, Kano listened. He did not interrupt or offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat with her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her fevered memories. He was a silent witness to her pain, and his quiet attention was a balm to her wounded spirit. She was not alone in her darkness. One night, as a violent chill racked her body, Kano did something that surprised her even in her fevered state. He lay down on the cot behind her, wrapping his arms and body around her. His warmth seeped into her, a steady, life-giving heat that fought back against the icy grip of the fever. He held her not with passion, but with a profound and gentle tenderness, as one might hold a frightened child. And then he began to sing. It was a low, melodic chant in his native tongue, a song that spoke of healing and strength, of the resilience of the mountain and the spirit. The song and his warmth slowly drove the cold away, lulling her into the first peaceful sleep she had known in days. When the fever finally broke, Lillian awoke to a world that seemed new and strangely clear. She felt weak, but the fire inside her had been extinguished. Kano was sitting by the hearth, watching her with his usual quiet intensity. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a captor or a savage, but the man who had saved her life. He had nursed her, protected her, and comforted her with a tenderness she had never known. He had stayed by her side through the darkest hours, a steadfast guardian. A profound sense of gratitude and trust washed over her. In the quiet aftermath of the fever, she knew that this man, this stranger, had given her back her life. And for the first time, this small cabin truly felt like a safe harbor. With Lillian's recovery, a new routine settled over their lives. They needed to replenish their dwindling supplies, which meant a trip to Dust Devil Creek. The thought of returning to the town filled Lillian with a deep sense of dread. She was no longer the same woman who had left it. She had survived. She had changed. And she was returning with the very man to whom she had been sold. The journey down the mountain was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, not a tense one. Kano rode his horse, while she sat in the small wagon they had loaded with furs for trade. She felt his occasional glance, a silent question asking if she was well. She would nod, and a quiet understanding would pass between them. The town was just as she remembered, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. But now, it felt different. The stares they received were hostile and filled with judgment. Women whispered behind their hands as she passed, and men stopped to gawk, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Lillian held her head high, refusing to show them her fear or her shame. She was not Joshua Mayhew's shamed daughter anymore. She was a survivor. As they approached the general store, she saw a familiar figure slumped on the porch. It was her father. He looked older, more broken than she remembered, a bottle held loosely in his hand. Her father saw them and stumbled to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of shame and drunken rage. "What are you doing here?" he slurred, pointing a trembling finger at Kano. "Look at you, with that heathen. Have you no decency?" His voice was loud, attracting a small crowd of onlookers. The old Lillian would have shrunk away, mortified. But the woman who had survived a fever and found strength in the mountains stood her ground. She stepped forward, placing herself between her father and Kano. "This man," she said, her voice clear and steady, has shown me more honor and respect in a few months than you have in my entire life. Do not speak to him that way." A stunned silence fell over the street. Her father stared at her speechless. She had never defied him before. Without another word, Lillian turned and walked into the store, Kano following closely behind. They bought their supplies, the storekeeper serving them with a new, grudging respect. The journey back up the mountain was quiet. As the town disappeared behind them, Kano reached into one of the supply sacks. He pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package and handed it to her. Inside was a warm, woolen shawl of a deep blue color. It was a simple, practical gift. But to Lillian, it was everything. It was not a present for a possession, but a gesture of care for a woman he valued. As autumn painted the mountains in hues of gold and crimson, a quiet peace settled in the cabin. It was no longer a prison, but a home. They worked together in a comfortable rhythm, preparing for the coming winter. They repaired the roof, chopped wood, and preserved the last of the berries and roots. Words were still sparse between them, but they were no longer needed. A shared glance, a small nod, a quiet smile. These were their language now. They understood each other on a level that transcended speech. The small cabin, which had once felt so empty and menacing, was now filled with a quiet sense of partnership and mutual respect that warmed it more than any fire. Their fragile peace was shattered one evening by the arrival of two riders. It was Sheriff Clayton and a well-dressed man Lillian did not recognize, who introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, a representative of the railroad. They dismounted without being invited, their arrogance a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the mountains. "Quiet Hawk," Clayton began, his tone condescending. "Mr. Sterling here has a business proposition for you. The railroad needs this land. They are prepared to offer you a fair price to relocate." The offer was an insult, a pittance for the land that was Kano's entire world. He had built his life here, in the solitude his people had occupied for generations. Kano stood before them, his face a mask of calm composure. He listened patiently until Sterling had finished his speech about progress and the inevitability of change. Then, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "This land is not for sale." Sterling's smile tightened. "I think you misunderstand. This is not a request. This is the future. You cannot stand in the way of progress. We will have this land, one way or another." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Clayton smirked, his hand resting on his firearm. "You should take the money, savage," he said. "It is more than you deserve." They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving a trail of tension and fear in their wake. The cabin felt cold and empty after they left. The threat they posed was real and immediate. Lillian saw the worry in Kano's eyes, a shadow that had not been there before. He was one man against the power of the railroad and a corrupt sheriff. That night a chill wind blew down from the peaks, a harbinger of the coming winter. Without a word, Lillian took her own thin blanket and added it to Kano's bedroll on the floor. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She simply lay down on her cot and turned to face the wall. A few moments later she heard him move. He shifted his bedroll closer to the hearth and closer to her. They slept that night separated by only a few feet of floor, finding a small comfort in their shared vulnerability. A few days later, Kano did not return from checking his trapline by dusk. As the shadows deepened and the moon rose high in the sky, a cold knot of dread tightened in Lillian's stomach. This was not like him. He was always careful, always punctual. Taking the rifle from its place above the door, she stepped out into the cold night. The moon cast long, eerie shadows through the trees. She called his name, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast wilderness. There was no answer but the sigh of the wind through the pines. Fear, cold and sharp, spurred her onward. She followed the familiar path of his trapline, her heart pounding with every step, praying she was wrong. She found him a mile from the cabin. He was lying on the ground, a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his deerskin shirt. He was conscious, but his face was pale and drawn with pain. "An ambush," he whispered, his voice weak. They did not even show their faces. It was Clayton's men. She had no doubt. She had to get him back to the cabin. With strength born of desperation, she managed to get him to his feet. Leaning heavily on her, he staggered through the woods, every step an agony. The journey was a nightmare of pain and exhaustion, but she refused to let him fall. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman fighting for the life of the man she had come to care for. Back in the relative safety of the cabin, she gently cut away his shirt. The wound was deep, the bullet still lodged inside. He was losing blood, and a fever was already beginning to set in. "You have to take it out," he rasped, his eyes clouded with pain. Her stomach churned with nausea. She had never done anything like this before. But looking at his face, she knew she had no choice. She took his longest, sharpest knife and held the tip in the flames of the fire until it glowed red. Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands, she knelt beside him. Following his whispered instructions, she probed the wound. The world narrowed to that single, terrible task. She would not fail him. The hours that followed were a blur of tending to his wound, forcing broth and water between his lips, and fighting his fever. She became his guardian, his nurse, his protector. During his recovery, the last of the barriers between them fell away. In the quiet hours of the night, as he drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, she would talk to him. She told him of her fears, her hopes, and the surprising peace she had found in this small mountain cabin. One evening, as his fever broke and clarity returned to his eyes, she sat by his side, watching the firelight dance on the walls. "I am not staying here because I have to," she said softly. "I am staying because I want to." His hand found hers in the dim light, and their fingers intertwined. Spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope. Kano's shoulder healed, leaving a scar that was a permanent reminder of the battle they had fought and won together. Their bond, forged in hardship and cemented in trust, had deepened into a quiet, profound love. One morning, he presented her with a simple, delicate necklace made of polished stones and carved beads. "In my culture," he said, his voice soft, "this is a question." Lillian did not need him to explain. She knew what he was asking. She took the necklace and allowed him to fasten it around her neck. Her answer was in her smile, and in the light that shone from her eyes. Their newfound happiness was short-lived. Sheriff Clayton, furious at their survival and emboldened by the railroad's money, decided to end things once and for all. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon, not with deputies but with a dozen hired guns, rough men with cold eyes and ready firearms. "This is your last chance, savage," Clayton yelled from a safe distance. "Leave this land, or we will burn you out." They had expected this. They had prepared. The windows were barricaded, and both rifles were loaded and ready. They would not run. This was their home, and they would defend it together, to the last. Lillian stood beside Kano, her fear replaced by a cold, steady resolve. The siege began. Gunfire erupted, splintering the log walls of the cabin. Kano and Lillian returned fire, their shots carefully aimed. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of cover and a deep knowledge of the terrain. The gunfight raged for nearly an hour, a chaotic symphony of explosions and shouting. Just as their ammunition was running low, a new sound joined the fray, the thunder of approaching horses. It was not more of Clayton's men. To their astonishment, it was Reverend Miller, the town's stoic preacher, and he was not alone. With him were a dozen townsfolk, honest farmers and ranchers, armed with hunting rifles and a sense of justice. They had finally had enough of Clayton's corruption. Caught between the cabin and the armed townsfolk, Clayton's hired guns quickly surrendered. The sheriff, seeing his power crumble, was captured. Their criminal plans were exposed for all to see. A month later, after the law had been restored to Dust Devil Creek, Kano and Lillian stood before the general store. In his hand, Kano held the original, crumpled bill of sale. "You are free, Lillian," he said quietly. She looked at him, her heart full. "I have been free since the day I chose to stay with you." Together they dropped the piece of paper into a burning barrel. They watched the symbol of her past turn to ash and drift away on the wind. They rode home not as owner and property, but as husband and wife, ready to build their future on the land they had fought for and won together.